Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to read from Exodus 9 and talk about the fear of God. We live in a society that does not fear God. People in our society do not fear God. People in our society are not afraid of what God might do to us if we disobey Him. People in our society are not afraid of what God might do to us after we die. The Bible teaches us that we should fear God. We should be afraid to disobey Him. We should be afraid of what might happen to us after we die. In this video, we're going to read from Exodus 9 and look at an example of where God warned the Egyptians of some coming destruction, and some Egyptians feared God and others didn't. The ones who feared God took steps to protect themselves. The ones who did not fear God did not protect themselves, and they suffered the consequences. The lesson to us is we need to listen when God gives us warning. And then we're going to look at a verse in 2 Corinthians where God tells us that there will be a judgment day after life here on earth. And if we don't listen to Him, we're going to suffer the consequences just as the Egyptians suffered consequences. Now, before we get into Exodus 9, let's review the first 8 chapters of Exodus just for some context. At the very beginning of Exodus, we're told that the Israelites moved from Canaan down to the land of Egypt because of a famine. And they were in Egypt for several centuries, and during that time they prospered and became very numerous. Then we're told that then the Egyptians turned the Israelites into slaves, and life got very hard and bitter for the Israelites. Then we're told about a man named Moses. Moses was an Israelite. And when Moses was an adult, he murdered an Egyptian, so he had to leave Egypt, and he fled over here to Midian. Moses was in Midian for several decades. One day God appeared to Moses in a burning bush and told him to go back to Egypt, talk to Pharaoh, lead the Israelites out of slavery, and lead the Israelites back to Canaan, the promised land. So Moses went from Midian back to Egypt. He talked to Pharaoh, but things actually got worse. Pharaoh made life worse for the Israelites. So at that point, Moses started bringing some plagues on the Egyptians to prove to Pharaoh that God was actually speaking through Moses. First, Moses threw his staff on the ground and became a serpent, and then Moses turned water of the Nile River into blood. Moses brought a plague of frogs on the Egyptians, then he brought a plague of gnats, and then he brought flies, and then he brought a pestilence on the livestock, where all the livestock of the Egyptians died. But through all those plagues and all those signs and miracles, Pharaoh refused to acknowledge God. Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites. And that's where we pick up reading in Exodus 9, verse 8. Then Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, "Take for yourselves handfuls of soot from a kiln and let Moses throw it toward the sky in the sight of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over all the land of Egypt and will become boils breaking out with sores on man and beast through all the land of Egypt." So Moses and Aaron took soot from a kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it toward the sky, and it became boils breaking out with sores on man and beast. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as well as on all the Egyptians. It's interesting that it mentions the magicians here because in previous chapters, and we talked about this in previous videos, when Moses first started performing these signs and miracles in front of Pharaoh, the magicians of Egypt were able to replicate those signs and make it look like they could do the same thing that Moses was doing. But that only lasted for a while. Eventually, Moses started performing signs and miracles that the magicians could not replicate. What I find interesting about the mention of the magicians here is that the boils were also on the magicians, which proved to Pharaoh that the magicians were powerless to stop whatever it was that Moses and God were doing to the Egyptians. Verse 12, "And Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh did not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as Yahweh had spoken to Moses." So notice God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and we're going to see why he did that in a little bit. Essentially, God was using this occasion to demonstrate His power and prove His existence. And so God was not ready for Pharaoh to give in, because God had more miracles and more signs that He wanted to perform in order to prove to the Egyptians that He was God, and also to prove to the Israelites that He is God. Now notice the words minor break. There's a little bit of a break in the dialogue here, and the next verse starts a new section and a new plague. Verse 13, "Then Yahweh said to Moses, Rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, Let my people, the Israelites, go that they may serve me. Now notice the words are indented a little bit here. One of the difficulties of one of the difficulties sometimes of understanding the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, is following all the quotes within quotes. Here we have a statement of action, and then these two lines are a quotation of what God said to Moses. These lines are a quotation of what God was telling Moses to say to Pharaoh, and then these two lines are the message from God to Pharaoh that Moses was supposed to deliver to Pharaoh while Moses was quoting God. And so we have a quote within a quote within a quote. And so that's why I indented those lines, just to help us follow those quotes. So again, God's message here to Pharaoh was, Let the Israelites go that they may serve me. Verse 14 continues God's message to Pharaoh. For this time I will send all my plagues on you and your servants and your people, the Egyptians, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. So again, the words so that tell us that God's about to explain why he's bringing all these plagues on Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And the reason was so that Pharaoh and the Egyptians would know that there's no one like God in all the earth. In other words, God was performing all these miracles to prove that he was the most powerful force in the earth and indeed in all the universe. Verse 15, and again, this continues God's message to Pharaoh. For if by now I had put forth my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, you would then have been cut off from the earth. Notice the words cut off. God's pointing out to Pharaoh here that God is actually powerful enough. He could just kill Pharaoh and all the Egyptians immediately if he chose to do so. And up to this point, God chose not to do that. But indeed, for this reason, I have allowed you to remain, in order to show you my power, and in order to proclaim my name through all the earth. So notice that God said, I have allowed. God was the one who was allowing Pharaoh to live. God was the one who was allowing Pharaoh to continue to be stubborn and resist God. But God was doing that because he wanted to demonstrate his power. I mentioned that a little bit ago. And also God wanted to proclaim his name. By doing all these miracles and demonstrating his power, God was proclaiming his name. God was proclaiming his strength and his power to all the earth. And indeed, he's proclaiming it to us because we have the written documentation of this that we can read today and read this demonstration of God's power. Verse 17, and again, this is God's message to Pharaoh. Still, you exalt yourself against my people, the Israelites, by not letting them go. Notice that Pharaoh was exalting himself. Behold, about this time tomorrow I will send a very heavy hail, such as has not been seen in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Now, therefore, bring your livestock and whatever you have in the field to safety. Every man and beast that is found in the field and is not brought home when the hail comes down on them will die. And notice the end of the quotation. That's the end of God's message to Pharaoh. But notice God gave the Egyptians warning. God told the Egyptians, this is what I'm about to do. God also told them what they could do to protect themselves. God told them if they brought their servants and their beasts inside, then they would not die when the hail came. Verse 20. The one among the servants of Pharaoh who feared the word of Yahweh made his servants and his livestock flee into the houses. But, notice the word but he who paid no regard to the word of Yahweh left his servants and his livestock in the field. So notice the contrast. Some of the Egyptians feared God and they took the steps to protect themselves. Some of the Egyptians did not fear God and they did not take the steps to protect themselves. Verse 22, Now Yahweh said to Moses, Stretch out your hand toward the sky, that hail may fall on all the land of Egypt, on man and on beast, and on every plant of the field throughout the land of Egypt. Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, and Yahweh sent thunder and hail, and fire ran down to the earth. And the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire flashing continually in the midst of the hail, very severe, such as had not been in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. The hail struck all that was in the field through all the land of Egypt, both man and beast. The hail also struck every plant of the field and shattered every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the sons of Israel were, there was no hail. Again, notice God made a distinction here. God brought this hail on the Egyptians. He did not bring it on the Israelites. Verse 27, Then Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron and said to them, I have sinned this time. Yahweh is the righteous one, and I and my people, the Egyptians, are the wicked ones. Now notice Pharaoh made a very clear statement. He said, I have sinned. He says, I and the wicked ones. God is the righteous ones. And this is a stronger statement from Pharaoh than we've seen up to this point. In previous videos, we saw occasions where Pharaoh would kind of give in to God and the Israelites, and he would sort of acknowledge God. But this is a much stronger statement than we saw any of those previous occasions. Verse 28, Make supplication to Yahweh, for there has been enough of God's thunder and hail, and I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer. Now here's another difference. In previous plagues, when Pharaoh told Moses the Israelites could go, Pharaoh said, well, you may go, but stay within the land or don't go far away. And Pharaoh was trying to keep control of the Israelites. Here, Pharaoh is simply saying, yeah, you're not going to stay any longer. Pharaoh wasn't putting any restrictions on it. Verse 29, Moses said to Pharaoh, As soon as I go out of the city, I will spread out my hands to Yahweh. The thunder will cease and there will be hail no longer, so that you may know that the earth is Yahweh's. Again, notice the phrase, so that you may know. God was doing this to demonstrate his power, and God was doing this so that Pharaoh would know that Yahweh owns the earth. Yahweh has ultimate control over everything that happens on the earth. Verse 30. And again, this is Moses speaking to Pharaoh. But as for you and your servants, I know that you do not yet fear Yahweh God. And so notice Moses really got to the heart of the issue here. Moses got it at this point, and Moses understood that Pharaoh still didn't fear God. Yes, Pharaoh was saying, yeah, you can go, but Moses had enough experiences of where Pharaoh said, yeah, take the plague away and I'll let you go, and then Pharaoh would renege on his promise. And this kind of indicates to me that Moses knew that that was going to happen again this time. Pharaoh was saying, yes, take the hail away and I'll let you go, but Moses knew as soon as the hail went away that Pharaoh was going to renege and would not let them go. And Moses knew that because he knew Pharaoh did not yet fear God. Now the flax and the barley were ruined, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in bud. But the wheat and the spelt were not ruined, for they ripened late. So Moses went out of the city from Pharaoh and spread out his hands to Yahweh, and the thunder and the hail ceased, and rain no longer poured on the earth. But, notice the word but when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned again, and hardened his heart, he and his servants. So notice that Pharaoh sinned, and he hardened his heart again. Verse 35, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not let the sons of Israel go, just as Yahweh had spoken through Moses. And then notice the words major break. That ends that particular section, and that's where we will stop reading in this video. So let's review. God went to send a message to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and God told them that a very severe hailstorm was coming. And some of the Egyptians feared God, and they took steps to protect themselves. Other Egyptians did not fear God, and they did not take steps to protect themselves. And those that did not fear God and did not protect themselves, they suffered the consequences. And the lesson to us is, we need to believe God when he gives us warning about coming judgments. And so next we're going to look at a verse in 2 Corinthians 5 where God gives us just such a warning. And this is 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. And so notice it says we must all. And this is not just non-Christians that are going to appear before the judgment seat of Christ. This is not just people who don't believe in Jesus. Everyone is going to appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and everyone is going to be recompensed for their deeds, whether it is good or bad. And so this is a very clear warning to us, and we should heed this warning. Now let me make a comment. I think some believers, when they read this verse, they have a line of thinking that goes something like, well, I'm a believer, I'm saved, I'm going to go to heaven for eternity, there's no tears, no crying, no suffering in heaven, therefore I have nothing to worry about. But I would warn you that yes, all of that is true, but I would warn you that when God gives us a warning like this, I think, God is all powerful, and I'm sure that God has a way when we get to heaven, even those of us who are believers, I'm sure God is going to have a way for recompensing us for whatever we may have done that's bad. And obviously we don't understand God completely. We don't know how He's going to do that. But when God gives us a warning that we're going to be recompensed for everything we've done, whether good or bad, even though we're going to spend eternity in heaven, I think we have to assume that God has a way of doing that. We should take this warning very seriously. So let's review. We live in a culture that does not fear God. Most people in our society do not fear what God will do to us if we disobey Him. Most people do not fear what God is going to do to us after we die. The Bible tells us that we should fear God. We saw in Exodus, we saw examples of where God gave warnings to the Egyptians, and He told them consequences if they did not do certain things. And the ones that feared God were able to protect themselves. The ones that did not fear God suffered the consequences. And we have in this verse a warning that eventually all of us are going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And so those of us who fear God need to heed this warning and do everything we can to learn what God expects of us so that we can live our lives in a way that is pleasing to God. But people who do not fear God do not heed this warning, and they do not take the steps to learn God and learn the Bible and learn what God expects from us. Thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. If you haven't already done so, please join my email list so that I can send you future videos for free. My email list is a free subscription, and your email address will not be sold nor given away. There are links on this video screen to take you to a sign-up page, or you can go to BibleMountain.com and click on follow. Also, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like this video and share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.